On July 3, 1948, Soviet engineers dynamited a bridge over the Elbe, and the lead vehicles of an American armored convoy rolled to a halt in front of the first battlefield of the nuclear age. To understand how 6,000 American soldiers came to be stranded on an autobahn deep inside the Soviet zone of Germany, you have to go back 9 days to a decision about money. On June 20, 1948, the Western powers introduced the Deutsche Mark in their occupation zones, anchoring the Marshall Plan's promise of European recovery to a stable German currency. Stalin understood exactly what that meant. A West German state was coming. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. His answer came on June 24. Every rail line, every road, every canal into West Berlin was cut. The city's 2.2 million civilians, garrisoned by fewer than 10,000 American, British, and French troops, sat 110 miles inside the Soviet zone, with roughly a month of food and coal. Stalin was gambling that hunger would do his work for him, that the West would either abandon Berlin or abandon its plans for Western Germany. The pressure was patient, deniable, and bloodless. It required only that the Western powers accept the logic of their own weakness. But in Washington, one general was arguing that weakness was precisely the thing they could not afford to show. What he set in motion would not stay bloodless for long. General Lucius Clay, the U.S. military governor in Germany, believed Stalin was bluffing. He had watched the Czechoslovak coup in February and Marshal Sokolovsky's walkout from the Allied Control Council in March, and he read them not as preludes to war, but as probes, tests of nerve that would stop the moment they met resistance. His proposal was simple and enormous. A combat team of 6,000 troops with engineers and armor would drive up the Helmstedt autobahn to Berlin, daring Soviet sentries to fire on it. Secretary of Defense James Forrestal and Army Chief of Staff Omar Bradley were appalled. The U.S. Army had shrunk to some 550,000 men worldwide, with barely a division equivalent and a lightly armed constabulary in all of Germany, against a Soviet order of battle that Western planners credited with 300 divisions. Bradley called the convoy what he believed it was, a hostage column. In our history, Truman agreed with Bradley, and the airlift began on June 26th. In this timeline, he does not, facing re-election in November, and haunted by the charge that America had already lost Czechoslovakia to inaction, Truman sides with the man on the ground. The convoy assembles at the zonal border near Helmstedt in the first days of July, and in Moscow, reading the same intelligence and the same map, Stalin quietly authorizes Sokolovsky to stop the column short of Berlin, without specifying exactly how. The autobahn crosses the Elbe near Magdeburg, and a river crossing is the oldest choke point in war. When the lead American vehicles came within sight of the bridge on July 3, Soviet engineers brought it down in front of them. It was, in its way, a careful move, a wall of rubble instead of a volley of shots, a message that the road was closed. But the American column had come equipped to bridge rivers because Clay had planned for exactly this. When U.S. Army engineers moved up to span the gap, the local Red Army commanders faced a choice their orders had not truly anticipated: allow the Americans to build their way through or stop them. They opened fire. What followed was not a battle in any planned sense. It was a halted column, miles long, strung along an embanked highway inside hostile territory, under artillery observation from the moment the first shell fell. The convoy could not advance across a dropped bridge under fire. It could not deploy off a road it did not control. By nightfall, several hundred Americans were dead or captured along the approaches to Magdeburg, and the survivors were digging in around their vehicles in the dark. For the first time in history, Soviet and American soldiers had fought each other. Neither government had ordered a war. Both now had one. The next 4 days decided the shape of everything that followed. In Berlin, the Western garrisons were surrounded the moment the shooting started, fewer than 10,000 men in an ocean of Soviet occupation forces. Ernst Reuter, the elected mayor the Soviets had blocked from office, went on the radio and called the city to resist, and Berlin police volunteers stood with American and British soldiers at barricades that everyone involved knew could not hold. The defense lasted long enough to become a memory the West would carry for a generation, and no longer. The garrisons capitulated. The remnants of the Magdeburg column, abandoning their vehicles, fought their way back down the autobahn corridor toward Helmstedt in small groups, and fewer than half made it. Then Sokolovsky's tank armies crossed the zonal border, and the fiction that the occupation forces could defend Germany died in an afternoon. Bradley, now responsible for salvaging a war he had predicted and opposed, gave the only order the map allowed: fall back, trade the country for time, and hold the Rhine. The consequences of that retreat would be catastrophic for every German in its path. But to understand what Truman did next, you have to understand what was left in his hand, because it was almost nothing. The American atomic stockpile in mid-1948 was about 50 Mark III bombs, and not one of them was ready to drop. Each sat unassembled. Each required a specialist team roughly 2 days to put together, and only a few dozen silverplate B-29s in the entire Air Force could carry them. This was the arsenal on which the defense of Europe now rested. Truman authorized the transfer of the weapons to military custody, a step he had resisted precisely because it made their use a military question rather than a political one, and Curtis LeMay's bombers staged through England, flying from the same bases that in our history hosted an atomic bluff with unmodified aircraft. The first strikes were not against cities. They fell on rail junctions, fuel depots, and troop concentrations behind the Soviet advance, because the Red Army's great weakness was the one thing its 300 divisions could not march without: supply. The bombs slowed the advance. They did not stop it. Assembly teams could ready only a few weapons a week. Target intelligence inside the Soviet Union was thin to the point of blindness, and every raid spent a measurable fraction of the entire Western arsenal. The atomic bomb was the only card America held. It was not a trump. It was a way to buy weeks. The Soviet spearheads reached the Rhine in the autumn of 1948 and stalled there, at the end of a supply line that LeMay's bombers had been methodically wrecking for 2 months. Numbers and artillery had carried the Red Army across Germany. Logistics could not carry it further. On the West Bank, a coalition that had no treaty to bind it held anyway. French, British, and American forces, joined by hastily rearmed German police units that no one in 1945 could have imagined fighting alongside, held the river line through the autumn. Ernest Bevin, who had built Western resolve on Berlin before a shot was fired, now worked to hold an alliance together before any document obliged it to exist. The Brussels Treaty Powers were fighting a war NATO had not been born to fight. In November, Truman won re-election as a wartime president, and Congress voted conscription and industrial mobilization on the scale of 1942. And in Moscow, Stalin confronted the arithmetic of a war he had half started. He had gotten what the blockade was meant to achieve. The Marshall Plan lay in ruins, Western European recovery buried under mobilization. But the price was a general war against an enemy whose industry was only beginning to wake, and no plan of his had priced that. By 1949, the war had settled into a pattern neither capital had chosen. Soviet offensives came in the spring, when the ground hardened. The American stockpile grew faster than Soviet defenses could adapt, and the atomic strikes that had begun against rail yards now fell on Soviet cities, a threshold crossed, not by decision so much as by momentum. The Washington Treaty was signed in April 1949, on schedule with our own history, but transformed in meaning, not a deterrent against a war that might come, but the charter of an alliance already bleeding. An occupied Germany, fought over twice in 5 years, became the war's charnel house, its people conscripted, bombed, and starved by both sides in a conflict that had begun as a dispute over their currency. It was in these years that officials on both sides began to speak openly of the road not taken. There had been a version of this crisis in which the answer to the blockade was coal and flour flown through the air, feeding a city rather than bombing one. That version had been on the table in Washington in June 1948. It had lost the argument by a single presidential decision. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed the recognition, on both sides, that neither could win. The armistice came in 1950, signed by governments that had each concluded the war could no longer be won at a price worth paying. It left Europe divided at the Rhine instead of the Elbe, Berlin a Soviet city, and millions dead in a conflict that began over a currency reform and a highway. There was no victory parade in any capital. There was only a line on a map drawn a few hundred miles west of where our own Cold War drew it, and a continent that would spend a generation rebuilding what 2 years of fighting had undone. The weight of this counterfactual lies in how narrow the margin was. Clay's convoy was a real proposal, argued by a serious man to a president under siege, and the objections that stopped it were not moral but military. Bradley and Forrestal simply judged that the army could not back the play. In our history, Truman chose the airlift, patience over force, supply planes over armor, and for 11 months the West answered a siege with groceries. Berlin held, the blockade lifted, and the first great test of the nuclear age passed without a shot, setting a precedent that would hold through 40 years of crises, that the unthinkable could be deterred, managed, and outlasted. The Cold War stayed cold because, at the moment, it could first have turned hot. Someone chose the slower road. History turns on such choices, and it does not announce at the time which ones they are.